Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back from another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, nobody is allowed to make the dear leader feel sad, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the Blue Sky Skeets subreddit, and that looks like a Blue Sky post from Matt Novak, who posted, House oversight hearing on ICE opens with the rules. It is also a clear violation of the rules of the House to make statements that might personally be offensive to the President or the Vice President of the United States. And yeah, personally, I think if you want to make statements that might be considered offensive to the President or the Vice President, you should be able to. Just because you're the President or the Vice President doesn't mean you're not allowed, it's illegal to offend you, I think it just goes to show you how much power people want to give the presidency. They want to make it be illegal to offend the president, and I think that's very anti-libertarian. Just because you have a special position or title doesn't mean that the rules shouldn't apply to you, and that you should make it so no one should be able to offend you. That's very anti-libertarian, and yeah, it's definitely why I think we've put too much power in the hands of the president. I think a lot of effects in a lot of terms, the president's mostly just a figurehead these days. But when it comes to Donald Trump, he's very much going to use the power of the presidency to try and make all criticism of him illegal. It seems like in this instance, and I don't think that is very libertarian. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have full video of today when Ro Khanna revealed Epstein Associates' names on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, protected by the Speech and Debate Clause, posted by Dr. Who 07, and that's a cross post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, I think he should be able to do so. Just because that the government redacted their names doesn't mean they shouldn't be held accountable. And I'm glad that Ro Khanna did share the names of those who he was able to share the names of, because they definitely should be held accountable for their role in all the Epstein stuff. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have watch Lauren Boebert exits DOJ reading room after reviewing unredacted Epstein files, posted by Dr. Who 07, and that's a cross post from the Res Publica DE subreddit. And yeah, personally, hopefully I think they'll hold the Epstein people accountable, but I personally don't think it's that likely. The Epstein class is mostly comprised of the ruling class, and the ruling class are never going to be the ones to really hold themselves accountable. And that's my thoughts there. Next we have Governors Won't Hold Trump Meeting After Only Republicans Invited, from thehill.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross post from the No Filter News subreddit. And yeah, personally, if the Trump only wanted to invite Republicans, I think he should be able to. But I definitely do think you should probably try to interact with everyone, not just those of your own party. But that's very much the people these days. They only just want to be circle jerked constantly. And you definitely see it when it comes to social media as well. People are only don't want to leave their echo chambers, and they only want to say the stuff that is only going to get a good response, rather than actively try and put themselves out there and debate with people who might disagree with them. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then next we have Lions Keep Lying, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross post from the Democratic U.S. subreddit, and it's entitled Siren Emoji Breaking. Rep Swalwell asked ICE Director Leons how we can tell bad guys from unmasked ICE thugs and fans, and Leons basically blatantly lies. You won't see ICE agents just snatching someone up. Reality disagrees. And I guess it's a clip of him saying that on C-SPAN. And yeah, personally, I don't care for Eric Swalwell. He banged a Chinese spy because he seems to be that unself-aware. But I definitely do agree that, ICE agents can go after anyone who they feel like, not just, people who might be dangerous criminals. And that's very much how, the state works. The state can say, we're only going after dangerous criminals, but they have the legal monopoly on the use of force to justify doing whatever they feel like. And yeah, I personally don't really care for ICE, but they're just one government agency, and Reddit only cares about ICE because they're in the out-group right now. I'm sure if it was an in-group agency doing this, or another less politicized agency, Reddit wouldn't care. And that just goes to show you Reddit's just mostly just DNC propaganda at this point. I personally don't care for RNC propaganda or DNC propaganda, but Reddit's mostly just DNC propaganda at this point. A large portion of X, I would say, is RNC propaganda as well, and that doesn't make it right either. But I think people are tired of social media propaganda as a whole at this point, I would say. Next we have Macron warns of renewed friction with U.S., urges EU to use Greenland moment to push reforms from NBCnews.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is the U.S. should keep to itself, and the EU should keep to itself, and every country should keep to itself. But sadly, that's not the way the world seems to be headed. The world seems to get increasingly more globalist with every passing decade. And yeah, I think the libertarian position is, we need people to focus on their own communities rather than global geopolitics. But sadly, the ruling class is more interested in global geopolitics and global governance at this point, with stuff like the World Economic Forum, and that's not something that I personally care for. But ultimately the ruling class is going to be interested in what the ruling class is interested in, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next we have grand jury fails to indict Democratic lawmakers who urge service members to disobey illegal Trump orders, from CNN.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, if they don't want to indict them, that's fine. But ultimately, I think the libertarian perspective is, government agents should be able to say whatever they want, and if people want to take or not take their advice, I think that's fine. I'm sure that if the parties were reversed and the lawmakers or Republican lawmakers are urging people to disobey illegal orders from a Democrat president, Reddit would think this is the worst thing ever. But ultimately, Reddit's just going to be biased, just like all the sources are going to be biased. And I think that's important to remember as well. So ultimately, law is ultimately whatever the police are willing to justify in any given moment, or whatever a jury is willing to justify. It's ultimately what matters is who's enforcing the law rather than what's actually written down on the piece of paper, I would say. And that's just a good example of that. If the jury is not going to indict, if the jury fails to indict them, that's on them. If they did indict them, that's on them too. Ultimately, the law is going to be whatever the people enforcing it say it is. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, from Epstein to Bezos, the ruling class is rotten to the core, from TheNation.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, I don't usually agree with a lot of what's on the subreddit, but it's definitely true. Of course, Reddit only usually cares about the outgroup, the Republican members of the ruling class, and a lot of people on X only care about the Democrat members of the ruling class. But I think it's important to remember that they're all pretty much a uniparty. We need to hold them all accountable, regardless if they have an R next to their name or a D next to their name. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Marjorie Taylor Greene. I got yelled at by Trump. He called me a traitor because I would not take my name off the discharge petition. He told his friends will get hurt. Everyone's getting mad at Pam Bondi. You can name anybody you want, but the man at the top is Trump. Posted by Donald Key, and that's crosswords from the Epstein subreddit. And that's a clip, I guess, of Marjorie Taylor Greene saying that. And yeah, I personally would agree with Marjorie Taylor Greene there. Harry S. Truman had a sign was on his desk of the White House when he was president. The buck stops here. I definitely do think we should definitely consider that when it comes to President Trump as well. Trump needs to be held accountable for his role of all the Epstein stuff, but sadly, as a member of the ruling class, I don't think it's that likely he'll ever be held accountable. The past 10 years have pretty much shown that he's never going to be held accountable for anything, and ultimately, there's nothing you can really do about it. Maybe someone's going to try to justify assassinating him, I guess, but even then, let's like that one guy who tried, ultimately, he's just one symptom of the problem. The ruling class goes far beyond Donald Trump, I would say. But the libertarian position is that, ultimately, hopefully they fall on their own accord. If people want to try violence or justifying whatever they want, ultimately they should be able to. But ultimately, I would say the ruling class is so deeply ingrained at this point, it's probably going to be nearly impossible to stop them. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Morality Police. TN Congressman calls for investigation into Bad Bunny Super Bowl performance, citing widespread twerking, from WBIR.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that, but the culture war is one of the tools that the ruling class uses to keep the American people divided, and it seems to be working very successfully. Next we have, America borrowed $43.5 billion a week in the first 4 months of the fiscal year, with debt interest on track to be over $1 trillion for 2026, from Fortune.com, posted by Flimsy Al 5563. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But ultimately, the U.S. government's going to justify borrowing however much money it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have how and why to turn off ring surveillance, posted from Day Image 14. That's a link from YouTube.com. It's a link from Steve Hofstetter, and they added let's see, how should I do? They added just a quick tutorial on how to turn off the ring surveillance. And yeah, I personally would turn it off if I could, but ultimately, my family doesn't currently have a ring camera, so I guess we don't really need it. But ultimately, I think the libertarian position, if you want to have a ring camera and want it surveying you, I think you should be able to. It could be helpful in like that some instances, like with that woman whose mother just got kidnapped and they found someone on the ring camera who looks suspicious. But ultimately, I think the libertarian position is if you want the ring camera to survey you, it should be able to. But if you don't want it on to survey you, you should be able to turn it off if you feel like it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Rafael Cruz says the quiet part out loud, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a cross post from the Wall Street Dad subreddit. Ted Cruz, how about we all come together and say, let's stop attacking pedophiles? And yeah, I think it's interesting how Reddit's all about anti-dead naming, but they always justify dead naming Ted Cruz because he's in-group rather than out-group. Or out-group rather than in-group, sorry. And yeah, personally, I think this clip's probably taken out of context, but ultimately, I do think the ruling class needs to be held accountable for how it's justifying using pedophilia and sex trafficking to kind of control people. Ultimately, Epstein, that was more kind of blackmail than actual nefarious pedophilia or sex trafficking, I would say. But regardless, it just goes to show you that you need to hold the elite class accountable for it. I'm sure if me or any other peasant had the same kind of sex trafficking or pedophilia ring, I'd be held accountable for it. But the ruling class does. They don't, because it's pirates and emperors. If an individual of lesser status does something, they'll be held accountable for it. But if an individual of higher status does something, they'll be able to find a way around the law whenever possible. Next, we have Thomas Massey to Pam Bondi. Here is an email that was sent by the victim's lawyers to the DOJ. It was a list of names not to redact. Released. What did the DOJ do with this email? They released it. Literally the worst thing you could do to the Epstein survivors you did. Posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross post from the Epstein subreddit. And yeah, personally, the government's going to justify releasing whatever it wants to release. Sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. And yeah, personally, I don't think they should have released it, but if they wanted to justify releasing it, that's on them. Next, we have ICE director says it will play key security role at World Cup. Post from Forbes.com, posted by The Way to Beauty. And yeah, personally, Reddit's always going to act like the World Cup's going to fail, even though the last two World Cups were successful, even though they were in countries more authoritarian than the US and Russia and Qatar. And also, FIFA's Club World Cup was held without a hitch pretty much in the US last summer. So if the US wants to keep doom-splaining about the World Cup, I think they should be able to. But as long as it's happening, I think it's going to be probably successful, even if Reddit personally doesn't want it to be successful. And then there was another post I wanted to share that I made to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit. I said, Libertarian Perspectives on Red Flag Laws, I said, it looks like they're going to be back in the headlines again after yesterday's shooting. I linked to an article from Juno News, exclusive family confirms identity of trans Tumblr Red shooter. And that was about how some Reddit transgender person, is probably very, very woke or something. Definitely crazy since they seem to be a Redditor. Being a Redditor is pretty much at this point, it's pretty much this progressive Al-Qaeda.com. It feels like it's me and a few other users. But anyway, I continue. Though they might be well-intentioned, I think the libertarian perspective is to be decisively against them. The words written in the Second Amendment are shall not be infringed, and the U.S. government constantly tries to find ways around the Constitution and Bill of Rights wherever applicable. It's important that we as libertarians try to hold them accountable for going against them as much as possible. Thoughts. And yeah, I definitely do think, red flag laws may be well-intentioned, but I do think if anyone wants to have access to a firearm, they should be able to, as long as, they're not actively violating the NAP. With that being said, you do have some cases that, can be hard, like if they're currently serving in prison, but ultimately I think, people are going to justify if they want to justify. If they want to justify having a gun anytime, I think they should be able to. It says shall not be infringed, but people always seem to try and find a way around that whenever they possible. And that's my thoughts there. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.